Welcome to Antidote Radio. This is Greg McCarran.
And this is Jeremy Roth-Cushel.
Jeremy, real quick before we get started, there were some major developments in the court case with you in the Kansas City Public Library regarding the event which you and I were, you were arrested and taken. We were both detained. The Dennis Ross event. You want to give a quick update on some of the proceedings that went down this past Friday?
Yes, it is now been resolved on the defensive side, and Stephen Woolfolk, the Kansas City public librarian, who was also arrested that evening, that we were at the Kansas City Public Library Plaza branch, also known as the Plaza branch if you're from Kansas City, with an event called Truman in Israel with Dennis Ross, that he has now been found not guilty on all three charges that had been escalated against him in the recent months. So this was a big victory, or at least a first step towards a victory in relationship to protecting the First Amendment from intrusions from parties who might not want certain things talked about in public. And this was this was a big ordeal for Steve. He was under indictment for 16 months for doing his job as a librarian, and trying to de-escalate a situation where a patron had been grabbed with basically no warning from behind by a private security officer who had been allowed into the place in the first place by Steve himself and the library, who'd given the other partners on that event, the Truman Library Institute and the Jewish Community Foundation, the delegated right to bring in private security. But it was made clear to the co-sponsoring parties that these officers, and one of them was a private security officer, a man named Blair Hawkins, who was the head of security for the Jewish community in Kansas City, who was then basically there on behalf of the Jewish Community Foundation to run security that evening on their behalf, along with three off-duty Kansas City police officers, two of them detectives and one of them a sergeant, I believe. They had been allowed there with the explicit agreement that they were not going to be using force against anybody except for a real security situation where there was a real threat to somebody's bodily security, and that also they would not be ejecting anybody in regards to speech unless there was full agreement from all three of the co-presenting parties, which include the Kansas City Public Library. But as the video that you very deftly took from our seats that evening showed, there was intense negative attention being given to the viewpoint of my question halfway through, actually, I would say. And then there was signaling going on, and then the Blair Hawkins, the head of security, then came up and grabbed me mid-sentence as I was responding on the microphone in a civil tone to Dennis Ross. And then Steve Woolfolk, the librarian, in a very legitimate and courageous fashion, just stepped very peacefully into the fold, said this is basically, he said, this is not the way we do things. He's allowed to speak, and he worked to de-escalate the situation as I was being thrown around in many ways by Blair Hawkins, with then the arresting officer, a man named Brent Parsons, who's a detective in the Kansas City Police Department, who had been at the local fusion center in a role of such things as counterterrorism and intelligence through that night that he arrested both of us. He was also trying to grab me, and I made it very clear, as the video shows, that I was not okay with being grabbed. I made it clear at least 3 times that I wanted their hands off of me, and I also made it clear that they could ask me to leave, And then I even offered up, I will leave if asked. So it was clear that I was not unwilling to leave if I were asked in a civil fashion without being assaulted. And then Steve Woolfolk, very effectively, he finally was able to de-escalate the situation. And then we started moving out of the auditorium. We met up with you at our seats. We were then told you had to leave. It's not clear why you had to leave. All you were doing was filming. And then we all left the auditorium, and eventually Steve was grabbed from behind with no warning, and then was never told he was under arrest. I was also then confronted by Detective Curley, told that I needed to produce my actual ID. And then without warning, I was also then grabbed and put in handcuffs with no announcement of any arrest happening. And so this has been going on for well over a year. I was under indictment for over a year until the first charge against me, the trespassing charge, which was specious on its surface because the venue holder themselves, the Kansas City Public Library, and their employee was actually arrested for saying the rules to these outside security forces. And so the trespassing charge never made any sense. Even if you were to say that someone could be trespassed despite the property holder's desires and intent, it was clear that I was willing to leave on the film that you took. And I just want to commend you, Greg, for having been under a difficult circumstance to be able to take that video. And I just want to point out that as I pointed out to the Sergeant Satter who searched us on the way in, and we were picked out of hundreds of people, and I think there was only two of us and maybe one other person I've now found out who was searched before being allowed to go into a public event at the public library. That Sergeant Satter who did interact with us in a very cordial and professional fashion. I made it clear to him that it was on the public record with making assertions and factual questions so that sometimes public figures would find uncomfortable, and that I would document it for the public record. He acknowledged, reconfirmed that was my right to do such things, and then allowed us into the event. So I would point out that it's only because we pursued press functions that there was any objective record of what actually happened in relationship to these security officers, to Steve Woolfolk, the librarian, with me, with you. And this video that you took was played multiple times at the trial this last Friday. And it was the objective evidence that I think held the ground against sort of a he said, she said type of situation. So again, the Supreme Court has already found that press is not a corporate right. It's not a right that's defined by the government. That press is a fundamental personal right that all people hold. So that's important, and we showed how important that is by under duress continuing to film in a situation where it actually became key evidence to protect the truth and to protect a librarian of honor just doing his job in protecting a patron from assault, basically over his expressive viewpoints. So it's a step towards a victory.
Yeah. On that note, with regards to Steve, I think it's important to point out that librarians are a profession. A lot of the time, we'll look at librarians. I don't know how people how our audience would view librarians. I guess a lot of time they would just be viewed as maybe being, generic liberals, or just being like bookworms or something of that. That don't have any really, they don't have any really big time or substantive views of any point as far as like philosophy, or as far as views on matters that are important to us go. But it should be pointed out that the case of Steve's case shows us that the library and the institution of being able to go and of the public library is very, very much, in a lot of ways, one of the last bastions of true free speech, one of the last true representations of Voltaire's quote of, I may not agree with what you have to say, but I will die for your right to defend your right to say it. It seems in a lot of ways that someone like Steve is one of the last representations of that, one of the last true bastions of that, and I think it just needs to be embraced.
Agreed. And your connection's getting a little garbled, Greg, but we were able to hear, I think, the content of what you said. And I do want to reaffirm what you're saying is that there's this sense of like librarians, they're sort of bookworms, and they're sort of maybe they're very introspective or they're meek or that may be true in terms of some people's personalities, but at the root of that, the librarians are I would say some of the frontline guardians of our most key rights in this country. That includes access to information, the access to inform yourself, even if you don't have lots of means to have your own big library, or even have access to the internet on your own. You can go to a library anywhere in the country and gain access to the internet to learn and to advance yourself intellectually, professionally, these types of things, and to gain access to books. And in this case, to gain access to public events where public figures come to discuss matters that are clearly important and when there might be a lot of contention. And so I agree with you. The library is a key place and there's obviously some tension there. The prosecutor would have never gone forward with these. This was a crazy case. Everybody who had their mind together knew this was a crazy case on the surface, and yet this proceeded well over a year. Because there's obviously some contention about the sovereignty and dignity of the library in relationship to parts of what is an escalating police state. Let us point out, and I would also point out that along the way that some people would say that the man who originally grabbed me, Blair Hawkins, was just sort of some ex cop from Seattle. And it's true, he was that, but he was also, he was a drug task force guy for a long time. He had interactions with the U.S. Marshal Service, and I found his resume online before it was taken down that showed that he was running security, it looks like, in Afghanistan on behalf of Karzai in the years after September 11th, running counterterrorism programs on behalf of the State Department. He was in Haiti, I believe, working to train police. He was in maybe Bosnia or in the Balkans, at least, defending a diplomat. So this was not just some random ex police officer. No, this was someone who had a long history in what's known as counterterrorism and in the U.S. national security apparatus. The other guy, because you can't have a private individual actually do a lawful arrest. They could do a citizen's arrest, but at some point it has to be handed over to an actual agent of the state. And so in this case, it was a man who was being paid to be there that evening by the co-sponsoring parties, the Truman Library Institute and the Jewish Community Foundation, this off-duty detective, Brent Parsons, who also, as I pointed out earlier, was a part of the Fusion Center. People need to get with it. The Fusion Centers, Department of Homeland Security. This was straight up, this is looking more and more like an operation that is designed to be against the average American person, to put a lot of us in databases in regards to the nature of our First Amendment protected core political speech. But the other thing that's really key about this, which has been completely de-emphasized by almost all of the mainstream press around this, is that both of these guys were trained, went to Israel for trips, security trips, training trips. And I would imagine if you go and look at what is the percentage of security and police officers in the greater Kansas City area who've actually been to Israel on training trips, I'll bet you it's not actually that high. I'll bet you it's under 10%. There's a tendency to pick a few people to go to these special trips to get special treatment and special training. And so, is it really a coincidence that these are the guys who ended up violating a designated public forum, very obviously based on the nature of the content and viewpoint and potentially persona of the speech and the person who was speaking it at a public library? And was it also the actual nature of the event that was a key part of why this happened? And so, while it is very important that, like you said, that it's important to defend people's freedom of speech in the abstract as something that everybody has a right to, I also think it's very important that we consider what the nature of the actual content of the speech that was being attacked in this case and that needed to be literally physically defended and legally defended, and why it was that kind of speech that was actually physically attacked. So this is a very important first step in a defense of the First Amendment in a case that looks like a very explicit and very wide example of virtually all of the rights protected under the First Amendment being under attack. And the judge in this case, Judge Joseph Locascio in Courtroom H at the Kansas City Municipal Court, I believe looks like he has done an admirable job throughout his history with this case in making sure that all the evidence that was needed by all the parties could be attained and then analyzed and then be put onto the record if necessary. And he heard all of the prosecution's witnesses. He heard all of the defense's witnesses. It was a long trial for a long afternoon at the city courthouse in Kansas City. And after it was done, those of us who had been out in the hallway who were witnesses for the defense, we heard of people coming out that he had ruled very quickly at the end and had said, he looked at the prosecutor and he said, "How did this happen? This was a public event. People may say ridiculous things at public events, but we scratch our head and move on. Not guilty on all three
Exactly.
charges." So there was a sense,
Excellent
there was
news.
a rebuking, or there was a rebuking of the process of the prosecutor's office continuing this onwards. And I would point out that the video that we made and that you held in under duress was critical, and that was delivered to the prosecution's office at our very first appearance at court more than a year ago. And the public had a sense that this was were trumped up charges, and so this is a good first step. And I would say this is only a first step, and there are still major civil rights issues at play here. And I just want to point one last thing out, is that this does not only have to do with speech and press, as it obviously does, but it also has to do with assembly. The ability for us to peaceably assemble, that means to not be assaulted when we're in a conversation that includes a lot of other people. And people have the right to respond to you after you said something and to tell you that you're full of it or to question your facts. That's part of the importance of the First Amendment. And then also, I didn't know, but it looks like religion was a part of this. I identified myself as Jewish American, but I was obviously not the right kind of Jewish American. And that the nature of the way that I hold both my Jewishness and my Americanness was in dispute by the people, and most obviously the person who arrested me, this detective Brent Parsons. He actually put an anti-Jewish bias code on my originating trespassing charge. I believe that probably if that charge had gone forward and I'd been found guilty, that bias code could have been used in a sentencing situation to extend my sentence, maybe to double my sentence or to double my penalties as some type of hate crime, or maybe it was a self-hate crime in the Orwellian language of groups such as the Anti-Defamation League or other obvious
Yeah.
partisan protectors of
Indeed.
the worst elements of the Israeli security apparatus, so-called.
Yeah, indeed. And, things happen for a reason at the time. Like, why is this happening to us? But now it's like, hey, this is very I mean, I don't want to say a positive thing that happened, but it's certainly something that happened for a reason. It appears that it happened for, I would say, for good reason if it raises awareness in the future and if it can be used as a moment to indicate where things are headed possibly, and also the power of there are still good people within the system at some levels that can be worked with, such as this judge Lacquaccio, as well as Steve Woolfolk, that there are still good people out there that will stand for the right things when in these circumstances. So definitely it happened for a reason. What is the state,
Yes.
real quick, what is the status of your case, Jeremy?
Yeah, so I also just want to agree with what you're saying there, and that it is the case that there are obviously people of good faith in both in the professions of in the library, in the court systems, in some parts of journalism, who are honest, and even though they may not agree with what you know and or believe and speak, they will defend your right to do so. And I would also just point out that we did not, although we did not seek this battle out, we went there to the event that night just to participate in good faith in the way that, like, I've participated in dozens, if not more than 100 of public events in different parts of the country, mainly in Los Angeles, and to record in different ways and do journalism and stuff like that. But though we didn't choose this battle, we are going to continue to engage with it in a peaceful and lawful fashion till its close. And that includes defending the rights of all of us in this country in an environment where there is an escalation of the assault on aspects of the First Amendment that's most obvious in relationship to the foreign military power operating out of Tel Aviv. But some of the status of my case is that my originating trespassing charge was dropped in the middle of June, within 48 hours of my lawyer sending a final notice, or it was sort of a courtesy letter reminding the prosecutor's office that they still had not fulfilled to provide us with discovery emails that we were allowed to get from them, as confirmed by Judge Lacascio in back in November of 2016. There had subsequently, we'd gotten emails from different parties and non-parties who were required to fulfill that too. But even through March, a hearing in March, the prosecutor's office had still not provided the discovery. And at that point, Judge Locascio had said something like to the prosecutor, Michael Heffernan, that if there's something, then you'll provide it, right? And then if there's nothing, then it's no big deal. And the prosecutor had said yes to that. And then months later, we still hadn't received anything, and we were heading towards depositions of the prosecution's witnesses, where we were going to ask some very serious questions about the nature of what happened, people's backgrounds, the nature of their apparent bias in relationship to what I was saying and who I might be, and so within 48 hours of that letter being sent to the prosecutor's office by my lawyer, the prosecutor just dropped the originating trespassing charge out of nowhere. And then about a month later, we still hadn't received the discovery, and we were heading towards deposition in a more intense fashion, and it needed to be worked out. And my lawyer began to talk to the prosecutor about him dismissing the remaining charge, which was a resisting arrest charge based on the idea of judicial economy, meaning, we've spent, thousands of dollars in helping defend me. My wife and I have taken out loans. Our friends and family have contributed and given us and loaned us resources, and in addition to offering us emotional backing. But also the time of the courts, the time of all the people involved in being a witness, the time that it takes to do depositions, the cost that it takes to do a deposition. And we were allowed, if I had been found guilty, which we didn't believe was very likely in terms of the amount of evidence and argumentation that we had on our side, we were going to be allowed what's called a trial de novo, meaning that I would have a right to pursue a clean jury trial with the charge that I've been found guilty for completely fresh. And my lawyer guaranteed the prosecutor that this was what we would do if we were to lose, which we didn't think was likely. And then he attested to the nature of my character also, so that the prosecutor would be able to say, look, this guy's not some type of menace to society who goes around menacing people at public events. And by showing that I hadn't been arrested since, hadn't even got a traffic ticket, and pointed out that I had over 100 hours since I was arrested in voluntary work in terms of our independent online radio show, The Antidote, hosted on No Lies Radio, also the participating in an academic based weekly news show, False Flag Weekly News, with Dr. Kevin Barrett and Professor Anthony Hall, which I've been on multiple times since the arrest, and you and I have even co-hosted. And then finally, a volunteer work that I've been doing completely of my own accord with the local at-risk youth in high school about hip-hop production and song creation. And a friend of mine in the area had been organizing this program, and he had invited me to participate, and so I've been doing this. And so we just use this to attest to the nature of my character, and that I'd also continued to participate in good faith fashion in additional events at the Kansas City Public Library, the Lawrence Public Library, and in my local municipal government. And then the prosecutor then dropped the remaining charge before we went into depositions, and he's described it as on paper as a diversion, but there was never any diversion agreement. It's obvious I was just doing the work that I do in the world, and we are attesting to my character. There was never any agreement to complete community service, and so basically a butt covering of some type of dishonest nature has been going on here. And so that was the end of my charges about weeks ago, up to 2 months ago, and then I've just been playing a role of continuing to analyze the evidence, and then I was a witness for the defense of Steve Woolfolk, who I want to applaud for his tenaciousness in standing up to this, and that I honor the role that he's played and that he's now being recognized for, and now he's been exonerated from charges of assault.
Excellent news altogether. Excellent news altogether. And I'll tell you what, ACLU, anybody from ACLU or any of those organizations is listening, if you want to defend somebody's free speech rights, instead of going out and making a big fuss about how Milo has a right to go out and just rile people up in Berkeley or the alt-right and go to Charlottesville or whatever and say whatever they want, why don't you take on some of these cases? Just a friendly suggestion.
It's a good point. I am not... I don't know. I don't think that's going to happen. I am going to pursue my own.
Obviously.
My own.
Yeah, I know it's not just a.
No, but I appreciate what you're saying, though, actually, Greg, and I think it's pretty telling that I haven't heard from the ACLU since this story's been out, which was almost a year ago since this story was made international news, and so some of that silence is a little bit telling. I'm hoping that Steve, who might be able to get some type of national organizations on his side around any case that he might have, and I am open to talking with groups that stand up for rights in different ways, who are interested in facilitating an exposure of what actually happened here in terms of this full-on assault on basically all aspects of the First Amendment. And like I said before, we didn't choose this, but we're going to finish this. And there's obviously lots of pieces to this that have to do with aspects of training. Like I said before, is it a coincidence that both of these guys were trained in Israel? And what is the nature of the escalating police state in relationship to those of us who might speak about the facts and truth of September 11th in a public fashion? So this is, I think, the beginning of a longer process here. But then here is September 11th coming along. And what is the nature of the pursuit of truth and justice in terms of September 11th?
It's an excellent question.
Go for it, Greg.
Excellent question. Once again, we've had this talk of the Israeli training of the police and how it was, it was a question regarding direct questions about Israel's role in 9/11. Actually, that was the information you provided in the question to Dennis Ross was based on the work of a Jewish American, Alan Sabrowski, who was concluded and asserted that Israel was the primary motivator. Elements within the Israeli government, within Israeli American circles, dual citizenship circles, both in the within the government as well as within the New York business and financial community, were the key conspirators involving the plotting and carrying out of the September 11th attacks. So that's key to understanding all of this with the talk of law enforcement in Israel and training. It all does seem to go back to September 11th, and in this case, it was a very much a vested interest in stifling the free speech of someone who was openly raising questions about this very event. And this does bring us to the topic of September 11th. What is the state of research as far as what's going on with September 11th? And we've noticed this, we've talked so much about this. I'd say this is probably the main thing that we talk about on here on The Antidote is alternative media, and how at one point in time we've gone over how the alternative media has always been there's always been issues with the alternative media and even the presentation of an event like September 11th. But for the longest time, we could count on most of the, quote, alternative media, the Alex Joneses and those types of media, was at least giving some good information out regarding September 11th and what may or may not have happened to the buildings and various entities and people involved in the plotting and carrying out of the attacks. And while it's always been questionable, at least there was a lot of good work coming out. But that is becoming less and less the case now over the last 3 or 4 years. And I would say especially since the rise of Donald Trump. Whereas now we've got people who just a few years ago really had an understanding, it seems, of the fact that this war on terror is basically just a myth. It's BS. It's fake. It's not real. And that the demonization of those in the Middle East who have been classified as our most imminent threat, as our biggest enemies, that it was largely a contrived threat. But now a large percentage of these people have regressed in their thinking to the point where you've got all this alternative and mainstream media propaganda regarding the imminent threat of radical Islam, and how it's not just a threat in the Middle East, but it's a threat to our own people and to our own societies. And I think that our understanding of this has regressed big time to the point to where even people who would consider themselves like wise and understanding of what Israel's all about and what Zionism's all about still have this belief that there's a eternally religious aspect to this, what's going on with some sectors of Islam in the West as well as in the Middle East. And I think our understanding of terrorism, of September 11th, of the roots of all of this has regressed big time, and I think this is a major problem. We're not having nearly as many voices within the alternative media that are even alluding to even a small truth about events like September 11th anymore.
Those are some good points, and I think it was the best of times, it was the worst of times actually to this in a certain way. And I think your assertion that there's aspects of the sort of the icons of the alternative media, both across the political spectrum, have in large part backed away from, reverted in relationship to these deep and serious questions about the entirety of the post so-called 9/11 world. At the same time, I think there's an advancement in the undercurrent in terms of we the people, even those of us who are not icons of media, alternative press, these types of things, who don't have the blue check mark by our name on Twitter. There's a lot of us who are increasing our knowledge, increasing the high level of perception of advancing our analysis of what September 11th really was, what is the post 9/11 world, who is driving it, for what reasons, and also where are the angles, what are the strategic angles, both in terms of countering epistemological warfare, but also political moves that could be able to begin to undo this. And so I do want to point out that while I'm interested to see what goes on the Alex Jones 9/11 of 2017 worldwide broadcast that's going on right now as we record, and how soon is it that Alex is going to bring on Netanyahu's son to discuss the cartoon that he posted that shows that the master of the universe is George Soros. George Soros is the quote evil Jew, and Netanyahu's son is being attacked by all the known parties, including, I believe, the Anti-Defamation League out of Israel, and saying that he is perpetrating stereotypes, anti-Semitic stereotypes. And this cartoon is funny. It's like it's got Soros in the background behind the reptilian, behind the then agents who are attacking his father, is I think what's going on, which would include someone like Ehud Barak. So we've come to a place now where it looks like you can have multiple people who are high-level, credibly accused suspects in the 9/11 operation, which one of them, of course, is Ehud Barak, former prime minister of Israel, but also former head of Israeli military intelligence, who was on BBC within maybe hours at the very most, saying exactly what this was. While everybody else was saying, we could have never imagined this, maybe this is Al-Qaeda, he was saying this is bin Laden, this is going to result in a long war where there's going to be American soldiers on the ground all over the world, and then also Benjamin Netanyahu, who not only has a background, is probably a high-level intellectual architect of the notion of a modern war on terror and of the idea of modern terrorism coming out of the Jerusalem Conference, but also was the guy who was immediately after September 11th was saying, well, this is good for Israel. Well, I don't mean it's good, but it's good in terms of the big wedding, as we discussed last week.
He meant it was good for Israel. He just didn't mean to say that on the public record like that.
Yes, and it goes even much deeper with Netanyahu, of course, and his weekly phone calls with the leaseholder, Larry Silverstein, of the World Trade Center, until large tons of its material, including the human beings in there, that were then vaporized and micronized in other ways, in other cases, by some type of high-tech or high-energetic weaponry and or explosives that were put in, very likely not by agents of Al-Qaeda or agents of Saudi Arabia, as the entire crew surrounding the contemporary InfoWars platform is likely going to be saying today. And and
the left as well. Many on the progressive left as well.
Well, of course, the progressive left will be saying these types of things, and it's interesting how this is a major part of agreement, is that the government is covering up how the Saudis did September 11th. How that's different from the official story is not clear. It's actually specious. Right? I mean, this is the official 9/11 story, and it doesn't hold up under scrutiny.
You've even got Bob Graham, the Senator Bob Graham, who's trotted out every 4 years, as you've observed, to almost like blackmail Saudi Arabia, related, of course, to the Meyer-Graham dynasty that ran the Washington Post for so long. Just published an op-ed in the Washington Post, I think about a week ago Sunday, comparing the Trump-Russia stuff to Saudi Arabia and the missing 9/11 information linking the Saudis to September 11th. So that's another example of how it works.
True. And, it's Saudi Arabia. It's not any kind of regime I'd like to defend, and they are guilty of numerous crimes, most explicitly against other people in their region, including many Muslims in Yemen. And do they have a lobby in the United States? Yes. But were they the movers and the shakers of September 11th and their access to these buildings that were all under the ownership and under the security control of hardcore Zionists? No, that's not the Saudis. That's something else. And I'd like to point out that There are some good things happening on the 9/11 activist tip, and I'm interested to see who will cover this. One of those things is that the architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth are teaming up with Bob McIlvaine, the father of Bobby McIlvaine, who was killed on September 11th, and then also a more recent NIST whistleblower. Who his name is Peter Michael Ketchum, and they are actually in D.C. today announcing a proposed act to investigate exactly how the buildings were destroyed in New York City on September 11th. And they are going to be going around and distributing information to every single congressperson. So I think that is a very laudable bit of 9/11 truth activism
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
we can get behind, and I will be interested to see whether the Posobiaks and the Cernoviches and the Roger Stones and
Yeah.
the Infowars crowd will even cover.
With regards to Saudi Arabia, we dislike the Saudi Arabian regime as much as anyone else does. We want to see the Saudi Arabian regime brought to justice as much as anyone else does. But the way to go about that is not to blame Saudi Arabia for crimes that it's not guilty of. We have. Here's the thing: when we get justice for September 11th, everybody that's involved is going to be, I think, held accountable for it, and that includes the Israelis. That includes any Saudis that were involved in setting up patsy hijackers to take the rap and take the fall. So really, the way to hold Saudi Arabia accountable is not to blame it for crimes that it's not guilty of. It's to take the entire crime into effect. They'll point the blame at Saudi Arabia where it belongs, but also to point the blame at the other parties where it belongs. So that's how I see it. We're going to get justice against all of these criminal regimes by actually telling the full truth. That's how we're going to get justice for all these regimes. Because we're not going to get justice for anybody if we only go around telling half truths and pinning blame on people where it doesn't belong.
It's very true, and it is the case that the truth is still going to hold sway here, I believe, and we need to keep pushing forward on that. And in so doing, it becomes very telling and very interesting about those who are unwilling to discuss elements of the facts with you, or who can't see the obvious forest for the trees in terms of September 11th and what the nature of the destruction in Manhattan actually suggests in a very highly obvious way about where the power centers were that could pull off something like that. You have to go look at security networks. You have to go look at who was actually humanly in charge at the trade towers in the time surrounding September 11th. And of course, then you hit up against things like the Kroll Company, which, by the way, we pointed out before. Jules Kroll, who started Kroll Incorporated, they were running security in the World Trade Center up into September 11th. He is on the board of John Jay College,
Yes.
and there was this big left forum that we've talked about before that was held and supported by John Jay College, and it was actually held right around the Kroll auditor or the Kroll atrium, where there was a big piece of World Trade Center steel that you could even see that had been weakened and misshapen and attacked by a high energetic material of some sort, and yet there we were, ostracized by the left forum, by supposedly the sort of most important, most principled single leftist gathering in the Western world. And those of us who wanted to talk about September 11th and most especially the relationship of September 11th to the Zionist partisans who have a different view of how the Middle East should be shaped and how it should be run, how that might be a key thing to talk about in relationship to global politics, war and peace, these types of things that the left is supposedly very interested in.
Yeah. I want to finish off with a point about the left here. We're going to get into something real quick before we finish up. But I want to say about, with regards to that, you want to extend that even further. And of course, you go into elements within the New York financial community, such as Louis Eisenberg and even a Ronald Lauder, who was involved with I believe, with the Port Authority at some level, involved in the process of leasing buildings and controlling properties. And where these people have a connection to Donald Trump, and people who are expecting Donald Trump to speak about September 11th, you're expecting him to throw people who, if he's obligated to anybody, it's people like this. And I don't see him throwing these people under the bus to start talking about how Israel did 9/11 for people who have hope that Trump's going to give any type of real truth about this matter. I mean, because he's very much connected to the financial criminals of September 11th at a high level.
And people will point out that Donald Trump has on the day of September 11th, maybe or soon thereafter, he acknowledged that it looked like there had been bombs been placed in the buildings. We never heard any follow up to that, and then we've seen.
Well, Dan Rather said it looked like a controlled demolition. Does that mean he's telling the truth about it?
Right, and there is a case that Dan Rather was telling the truth in the moment, and Donald Trump was telling the truth in the moment.
And Dan Rather also said that reporters were being silenced post September 11th.
Yes,
so there was some truth there too. But the difference between Dan Rather and Donald Trump is Dan Rather is not regarded by a large portion of the conspiracy movement as a great truth teller. So.
Yeah, and I would point out one interesting thing about Dan Rather, which I believe is true, is that you remember that a key part of the 2004 so-called re-election of George W. Bush, which was still based on pretty obvious election fraud in Ohio, and while Rove's IT guru Mike Connell was still alive before he was black opt in a plane crash years later, after he was about to testify, before he was about to testify, that in the midst of the 2004 election season, there was a big deal made out of this story that was floated to Dan Rather about Bush, and I believe in relationship to National Guard service and some funny business around that. And then it turned out that it had sort of been faked, or aspects of it had been falsified. I believe it is in the Roger Stone documentary in Netflix that Roger Stone had a key part in that operation. So whether that is true or not, it is interesting that these are the kind of people that are the sort of biggest backers of Donald Trump. These are the main players that surround Alex Jones, who's claimed himself to be the godfather of the 9/11 truth movement. In fact, Alex Jones is more like the dirty uncle of the 9/11 truth movement, who after some really nasty remarks at Thanksgiving wants to sort of tag along to the after party, and you're like, get the heck out of here.
That's a great point. And just look no further than Jerome Corsi, the press correspondent who actually was Mr. Swiftboat himself, who wrote a book with Ken Black, Ohio Attorney General, who was instrumental in rigging in Ohio in 2004 about bringing morality and values back to America. So, I mean, it's just this nasty, nasty sect of people, and it's amazing how it works out.
It should
Alex
also
Jones
be pointed out that Dan Rather on September 11th was the one who was pursuing the questions about the many Israeli-linked white vans that were detained and arrested that day. Then there was very little follow-up, and I've seen the 9/11 myths debunker people on their question page about the celebrating Israelis and these other apparent vans that were stopped with explosives in them, as reported by Dan Rather and others on the mainstream media, that, well, Bernie Carrick since then basically said there was nothing to that, and then another unnamed official said there was nothing to that, and so that was the end of that. So I would point out to people there's something very strong there. A lot has been made of the so-called dancing Israelis, which is a very important story. But as I pointed out before, that there's something about it that is a red herring and a limited hangout. It puts Israeli intelligence across the Bay into New Jersey, just sort of watching and celebrating and documenting the big wedding, instead of these other white vans that were alleged to have actual explosives in them about on their way or on the George Washington Bridge and potentially the Lincoln Tunnel, to create an even bigger terroristic spectacle for the people of Manhattan, taking out the only ways out in towards that that direction from Manhattan. And you got to remember, there were parts of September 11th that did not that were not successful, including Flight 93. What was the deal with what that operation was about? Was that about the Congress? Was that about the Capitol building? Was that about the White House? Was 9/11 actually meant to really fully install a full-on martial law scenario, rather than this sort of footsie towards dictatorship? So in the midst of that, we had some time that was bought for us by probably certain more patriotic elements inside who were able to stop elements of this attack. And now we need to follow the truth to its root, and that includes across the entire political spectrum. So maybe we could just talk about some of these tweets by Robbie Martin that
Yes, that's
were
what I was
brought
going to
up.
get into.
Go
Yeah,
for it,
it's
Greg.
interesting. And of course, we've talked a lot about Robbie and Abby Martin. If you want to talk about the left of 9/11 truth, Abby would be a figure who came out of the left who, for a while, for a long period of time, for years, was a key figure as far as bringing a 9/11 truth from a more, say, left perspective. And she's, since we've talked about in depth, regressed on a lot of this. And of course, with brother Robbie, we talked about how I wrote an article about Max Blumenthal and his tweets about Abby Martin and 9/11, and how he teamed up essentially with John Gold to remove my posting privileges from 9/11 Blogger after that article was published there. But recently, Robbie just came out with a series of tweets about how, left icons, people who what kind of stuff is this, that you're not going to out somebody as having honest beliefs about the most crucial, most consequential event of our time because they're considered icons and it would be rude. I mean, that's kind of an odd way to go about it, especially for a truther, for a truth figure.
But it is the case that this is sort of these tweets are very interesting. People should go look at them in terms of what they mean about their potential heroes on the left. And it also points out, like you said, what does this mean about the relationship of people who have been more 9/11 truth friendly, who are even come out of 9/11 truth in a certain way, like Robbie Martin, Abby Martin, in relationship to these icons of the left. In terms of keeping their secrets for them, in terms of modulating the nature of their speech in large fashion in relationship to the way that these kind of icons of the left might perceive as so-called credible language or credible journalism, such as, like you said, Max Blumenthal and his relationship to what he's termed trutherism. Okay, I agree. There is an aspect to things like trutherism where it's about where you watch a DVD and then assume that every fact that you saw in Loose Change is exactly true and portrayed in a perfect context, or you watch an Alex Jones show or Alex Jones documentary and you just start spewing, rehashing all of the facts that you saw, and that is somehow the truth. And there is that aspect, and many of those people have actually washed out, I believe, into the Trump movement in many ways. But meanwhile, the truth movement was always based upon real true skeptics, real true critical thinkers who didn't just take other people's words for facts, who we would double reference, cross reference, triple check facts, read the debunkers pages, to actually winnow through and sift through the straw men and the bad facts, the misinformation, the disinformation, to find what the actual ground reality was. So, okay, I agree. Trutherism is not to be a cult to be fallen into. But even worse is liarism. And this is the cult in relationship to deep events, the big events that change people's consciousness, that people like Max Blumenthal and Noam Chomsky somehow are either nowhere to be found, they're either silent, but in a lot of times they're worse than silent. They're slanderous. They attack those who have a critical eye towards these types of events, such as September 11th. No one can deny that September 11th was a crucial event. It's obvious that there's some type of cowardice here. That's what Robbie Martin has exposed on these tweets, and I think it's I applaud Robbie for exposing that on these tweets, that there is some type of cowardice going on amongst big people on the left, and he's left it for everybody to just speculate about who that might be. I imagine it's people like Naomi Klein or people like Jeremy Scahill. I don't think it's people like Glenn Greenwald, but maybe it is. Who knows?
It's
So
funny how he has more. It's funny how he claims how he actually like acts like he has more respect for these closet truthers who don't have the courage to say what he think what he asserts that they're saying in public that he does for people like Bolin or Kevin Barrett who actually do who say think whatever you want about them. They actually do make their thoughts publicly known. So he has more respect for these left icons than he does for people who are actually out there putting their stuff out publicly.
that's a good point, and so they've kept their credibility somehow by being basically by being keeping back or being dishonest about the still most important single event of the century. I mean, it's not. Look, I'm in a place where I understand. Like, not people are not going to focus, tons of their intellectual or activist effort on a single event that would happen more than a decade and a half ago. At the same time, there has to be a sort of baseline of honesty. If you want to be involved in public discourse around issues like war and peace, the future of human civilization, the United States of America, the Middle East, human rights, these types of things, there has to be at least a baseline of honesty around such an event as September 11th. Unless you have that, then all you have is the mumblings of people who are not even courageous to basically say an orange is an orange, even though NIST scientists tell me that it's an apple. So that is the basis of this. We need to be able to have a moral courage to say what we know to be true. If people are your so-called intellectual leaders and they're not letting you know that they think something that you think, but then you become scared to say it in public because then it'll violate your integrity. I mean, your credibility, and other people will think you're crazy. So that's just not fair. So that's the type of thing that ends up being where certain people are assaulted in public. Let me say, arrested for speech, and then said that they're weird or it's ridiculous or these types of things. So there are, material domestic consequences of people who are not willing to speak their mind. But of course, the much deeper, more intense, much more violent consequences of that silence is the ongoing death and destruction that is both primary in relationship to the usage of the U.S. war machine against multiple nations, expanding continents, millions of individuals around the world in relationship to an obvious high-level fraud that's a singular, more treasonous event in American history cannot be found.
Exactly.
It's publicly accessible. It's open source. Yeah. It can be seen and then spoken by we, the people. That includes the American people. That includes all the people of the world. So in a day and age of open treason, then we are all whistleblowers, Daniel Ellsberg.
Yes, indeed, and I couldn't have finished it off any better. Thank you, Jeremy, for doing this show with me and for bearing with me through my audio problems today. And thank you so much. And so hopefully everybody gets something out of that. Apologize for the audio problems, but
okay,
I
thank you,
think
Greg.
there's a lot of good information in this show, so I hope people will bear with us and check it out.
The best to you, and prayers to everybody who is under assault from hurricanes and earthquakes around the world.
Indeed.
Till next week.
Out.